Thank you, Diane. And Diane will take any help tonight to help her move, packing boxes, moving boxes, right? All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Our speaker tonight is Brian Buck. He's going to be talking to us about some gruesome, gory deaths in the Park City shafts. Just in time for Halloween, right? All right. So just a little background on Brian. He has degrees in geology and geological engineering, and he's worked in the Western U.S. at a variety of mines since about 1976. He also enjoys mining history and specifically Park City mining history. He's done quite a few interesting presentations, and he's also a member of Friends of Ski Mountain Mining History, the Park City Museum. He contributes articles about Park City mining history in the Park Record. And fortunately for the Friends of Ski Mountain Mining History, he is our project manager for all of our mining infrastructure stabilization projects. And we really appreciate his in-depth project management skills, construction skills, and he works very well with our various contractors, making sure that we get the biggest bang for our buck. And also that people, do the work as safely as possible. There's a lot of regulatory issues that we have to deal with, and working with Park City Mountain Resort and Vail and various other entities. So it's a complex job. Just want to, toot his horn a little bit for him. Recently completed the Silver King Coalition mine hoist building. That was a very large undertaking. And the next big project on tap is the stabilization of the Thanes hoist building structure and the plugging of that shaft. So stay tuned for updates on that next year. Without further ado, I present to you Brian Buck.
Thank you, everyone. I sure appreciate you coming out tonight and attending this lecture. We scheduled this a year and a half ago because I thought the absolute best time to do this lecture was the Wednesday before Halloween. And so that is kind of constraining scheduling. And so thank you, Diane, for getting it scheduled for tonight. Last year, I did research in a number of newspaper archives in Utah, especially the Park Record, looking for articles about accidents and fatalities in Park City mine shafts. Now, don't go thinking about what's up here. My full report on that work has been donated to the Park City Museum. It's a 29-page report. There's over 50 incidents of accidents in shafts in that report. But we're just going to do a summary of that tonight. First, I want to provide some general background on the safety risks that faced miners back then. And most of what we're looking at here is going to be the last decades of the 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th century. So this photo on the cover sheet here shows a rather crude shaft facility with somewhat simple equipment for sinking the shaft. And you can see two miners are wearing slickers, and they're standing on the lip of a bucket, and that's a sinking bucket to sink a shaft. That bucket is likely all they have to make the trips down and up the shaft. What could go wrong with this type of operation? So my goal tonight is not to denigrate the early mining industry for its general toleration of unsafe work practices back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Almost all industrial work back then was done with hand labor. And there were plenty of able-bodied men anxious to leave the farm and work for a mine, a railroad, or a factory where they could earn more money. So, unfortunately, employee safety was not a commercial priority at the time. So now let's look at some of the more common hazards that Park City miners encountered in their work. I think most of us here understand the risk of cave-ins, any underground opening. Mine tunnels were equipped with wood posts and beams to help support the roof. Mine stopes, where the ore was removed, were also fitted with wood structures to support the walls and the roof. If you go to the Park City Museum, there's an excellent display there of underground mining methods, and you can see this. Needless to say, sometimes these wood supports could fail with tragic consequences for any miners in the vicinity. Blasting rock underground was dangerous for miners inserting the dynamite, also called powder by the miners, installing the fuses, lighting them, and then escaping to a safe area before the blast goes off. Then there was the risk of asphyxiation or poisoning by the gases produced by the blasts. So the miners needed to pay attention to mine ventilation. Finally, severe risks occurred when some of the powder did not detonate and the miners returned to work at the face, only to have it explode into their face. My explanation of the July 1902 Daily West explosion will be covered in my presentation. I'll be back here on December 3rd, and we'll talk more about that. After a blast at the mine face, one of the first actions taken by miners entering the area was to pry out any loose and overhanging rock so it wouldn't fall on them later. This is called scaling and was done with long steel bars. This was risky because the miner could just initiate a fall of a big rock on him. There are multiple accounts in the park record of accidents occurring in the mines with miners doing scaling. Injuries or deaths from falling rock in underground openings could occur almost anywhere and any time in the Park City mines. It was always newsworthy for the park record to publish these accounts of the accidents from fellow miners who may have only been a few steps away from where one of their fellows was hurt or killed by falling rock. I'm intrigued with this photograph of these miners apparently drilling out a pillar of rock between two mine tunnels to likely blast it out. What could go wrong here? But the real purpose of my showing this photo is the fact that the use of pneumatic drills in underground mining created very dusty conditions for miners. See all the dust coating everything in this photo? Miners breathe this dust, which could result in silicosis of their lungs, or lead poisoning when mining ore with very high lead content, like around Park City. The park record archives include reports of miners with lead poisoning or dying of silicosis, which was called miners' consumption back in the old days. Having covered various risks the miners faced at their work site underground, let's now focus on what they faced just making the daily trips in the shafts to get to their work. Now, before reading any of the newspaper articles, we need to review some mining terminology to understand what is described in the articles. Here in this photograph is the old head frame that used to stand over the Daily West shaft. The cables hanging down from the top of the head frame and angling down to the right were attached to the hoisting equipment just out of view from this photograph to the right. These cables, called ropes by the miners, lead to the top of the head frame, over some pulleys called shiv wheels, and then straight down the shaft in the hoisting compartments. This drawing helps us understand some more of mining terminology that we will encounter tonight. Note the vertical shaft on the left side of the photo and the inclined shaft on the right side. Men and materials were transported up and down the shafts in what were called cages. At various depths down the shaft, there would be levels or stations where miners excavated tunnels or drifts out from the shaft and leading to where the ore could be encountered and mined in a stope. These levels were named for their depth down the shaft. For example, the level that was 500 feet down a shaft would be called the 500 level, and so on. The excavated rock from underground mining would be raised into cages with mine cars pushed onto the decks of the cages at the level stations. Some mines had special containers called skips to raise the mined rock out of the shaft. The bottom of the shafts extended deeper than the deepest level, and this was called the sump because many shafts collected groundwater in the bottom of the shaft to be pumped up for disposal. Now, mine shafts were not smooth holes in the ground. They were fitted with wood timber frames called sets on a regular spacing all the way down the shaft, usually about every 5 feet or so. These timbers divided the shafts into multiple compartments. Here's what these timbers look like in an actual mine shaft looking down one of the hoisting compartments. Note the wood guides attached to the timbers and leading down the shaft. These guided the movement of the cages up and down the shaft. There is another hoisting compartment to the right of the one we're looking down. You can just see it off there to the right. And there's also a third compartment off to the left. And perhaps that's a service compartment or manway that would contain ladders and piping. Now, the hoisting compartments had elevator cages that traveled up and down, controlled by the hoisting cables or ropes. The top of the photo here shows a typical open cage used in the early days of mining in Park City. Note the roof or hood on top of the cage to protect the miners in the cage from anything that might fall down the shaft on top of them. But all 4 sides of the cage are open, leaving the miners riding the cage exposed to those timber sets rushing by as the cage went down the shaft. There was typically only a few inches of clearance between the edge of the cage and the timber frames in the shaft. The bottom of the photo is a later cage design that includes, as you can see, sidewalls and doors for safety. Cages were often fitted with 2 decks to double their capacity. The left cage in this photo is holding mine cars that could be rolled onto the cage at the shaft stations. The right-hand cage is empty and ready to transport miners. The cages shown here have sidewalls and drop bars, front and back, for extra security. Now here's an early photo of a surface station of a 3-compartment shaft. The leftmost compartment has a cage at the surface ready to transport some men down the shaft. The middle compartment has a cage at the surface with a mine car and a miner ready to push it off the cage. Note how these cages are open on all sides. The other 2 miners are pushing a mine car away from that right-hand compartment, where you can see the hoisting cable, which means the cage is now further down the shaft, and the miners are standing on the edge of that open compartment. Also note the iron floor around the shaft to allow the mine cars to be maneuvered over the floor. All right. So with that background, we're ready to read some articles. I've divided these into a few general categories, beginning with what I call overruns of the cages. An overrun is when the hoist operator loses track of where the cage is in the shaft and accidentally runs the cage all the way up into the top of the headframe instead of stopping it at the ground level. These head frames were typically 50 to 80 feet high, so men on overrun cages were in extreme danger of falling. So as we go forward, I will simply read these articles to you. You may choose to follow along, or you could close your eyes as I read and imagine what these incidents might have looked like. Some of these articles are a little graphic and may not be suitable for children less than 30 years old. So you have been warned. Or maybe that's why you're here tonight. Oops. Here we go. January 17, 1891. I got to put my glasses on. W.T. Williams. Again, the record is called upon to chronicle the sudden termination of a human life, to record the cutting down of a young man in the very prime of life without a moment's warning. Such was the fate of Mr. W.T. Williams this morning at the Ontario No. 3 shaft. He and 10 other employees at the mine went to work this morning and, as been customary all winter, walked up through the No. 1 Ontario drain tunnel, which connects with the shaft on the 600 level, where they then take the cage to the surface to change their clothes. The men got on the cage, the upper deck of which contained a loaded mine car. W.T. Williams and Tom Charles got on the upper deck of the cage, and the others on the lower deck. The signal was given to hoist, and the cage went up with a rush. When it reached the surface, it failed to stop, but went on up and was jammed into the sheaves of the head frame with such violence that the mine car and Mr. Williams were thrown to the floor, a distance of nearly 60 feet. The unfortunate man fell on the iron turn sheet covering the floor around the top of the shaft, striking his head and shoulders, and when picked up, was unconscious. He lived only about 20 minutes after the accident and died without regaining consciousness. So here's a photograph of the steam-powered hoist that was installed in 1893 at the Silver King mine shaft near Park City. 2 large steam engines powered the 2 hoisting reels that controlled the steel ropes leading up to the top of the head frame and then down the shaft hoisting compartments. The hoist operator, also called the hoist engineer, needed to keep track of the mechanical doings of the hoist machinery and the steam engines under his control. He also had to pay attention to the bell signals from the shaft stations that were communicated up the shaft to him via a pull cord. With so many demands on him, the hoist operator had to pay attention and avoid distractions. May 18, 1895, anchor shaft, Frank Woolsey and Samuel Simmons. The fatality happened at the anchor shaft and resulted in Frank Woolsey and Samuel Simmons being thrown into the shaft and falling to the 1400 level. It was an awful fate, and both men were mangled and crushed out of all semblance of humanity. Heads, arms, and legs were torn off, and shreds of flesh and bones were found clinging to the shaft timbers from top to bottom. Woolsey, Simmons, and William Jennings were at work on the 1400 level and, having fired a round of holes, prepared to come on up and eat lunch. The cage started and traveled all right until near the 300 level, when its speed rapidly increased, and in spite of the efforts of engineer Hughes, it crashed into the sheaves, and all 3 of the men were thrown off. Woolsey and Simmons fell down the opposite shaft compartment, while Jennings escaped death in a most miraculous manner. The force of the crash threw him fully 6 feet into the air, and he fell upon a small platform on the top of the headframe, where he held on even though unconscious. Had he fallen, he would have gone into the shaft or been dashed to death on the iron turn sheet on the floor of the shaft building 60 feet below. Here's the hoist station at the early Daly mine shaft. The engineer would keep track of where the cages were in the shaft with the cylindrical indicators in front of him. And let me just point those out to you. See this? That cylinder and that cylinder are the indicators that tells the hoist engineer where the cage is. So he would keep track of the cages with those indicators, and by watching the movement of the hoist ropes and cages within the head frame that you can see in the background. In this daytime photo, it's actually hard to clearly make out the details in the background. One wonders how well lit this place would be at night with just a few oil lanterns. April 29, 1899, anchor shaft, William Byrne. One of those distressing and inexcusable accidents happened at the Anchor mine shaft Wednesday evening, which nearly caused the sacrifice of a young man's life. About 8 o'clock in the evening, William Byrne, a station tender, had occasion to go to the surface from the 1200 level and gave the proper signal. William Pattison, the engineer, hoisted the cage, but instead of stopping at the surface, ran the cage up into the sheaves, otherwise demolishing it. Mr. Byrne was thrown out, but miraculously succeeded in catching himself with one hand on a portion of the cage, and finally in pulling himself up to the platform near the sheaves. How he did it by himself, he does not know, as he was nearly paralyzed with fear when he realized what was about to happen as the cage flew past the mouth of the shaft. Had his grip failed him, he would have fallen to instant death down a shaft 1,600 feet deep. It would seem that the engineer was entirely to blame for the accident, his only excuse being that it was rather dark and he could not see the hoist level indicator very plainly. So the next few articles are about miners working at the shaft level stations underground. There are multiple incidents described in the park record where miners fell down shafts from the shaft stations. Here's a photo of an Ontario mine shaft station near Park City, where the hoisting compartments are way on the right-hand side of the photo, back in the dark. One of the compartments has a cage stopped at the level, and the other compartment is open with the cage lower in the shaft. There are simple safety bars guarding the shaft. The scene is fairly dark in this photo, even with the camera flash. What do you think this scene would look like when it's lit just with candles or maybe an oil lantern? July 13, 1907, Silver King mine shaft, Ed Cotter. At about 8 o'clock yesterday morning, Ed Cotter, one of the camp's respected and old-time residents, walked into the north shaft compartment of the Silver King mine at the 700-foot level and fell to the sump a distance of 600 feet. His body was terribly mutilated, portions of it being brought to the surface in a candle box after the accident, and death was doubtless instantaneous. Cotter was engaged in taking powder from the cage to the drift on the 700 level when the accident occurred. He had made one trip, and when he went back for another load, instead of going to the cage, he ducked under the bar at the other shaft compartment and went to the bottom. Here's another shaft station in the Ontario mine, again brightly lit by the camera flash. Note the two production compartments of the shaft in the back, with a cage present in the right-hand compartment, and the cage in the left-hand compartment is apparently higher up the shaft. The open left-hand compartment is guarded by a simple safety bar. You can see the guy standing in front of it. Yes. The station is lit with one overhead oil lamp. The appearance of the cage is not that noticeable compared to the open compartment on the left, and one can imagine this would be even less obvious in the relative darkness that would be typical for this station. Also, a miner loading a mine car onto the cage might be crouched over and not have a real good look at the shaft while pushing more than a ton of weight in the mine car. April 1st, 1911, Daily Judge Shaft, John Tick. Monday night at the Daily Judge mine, another of those unexplainable accidents occurred, which resulted in the death of John Tick, an Austrian about 23 years of age. He was a station tender and was on the 1200 level. He had just put a car on the lower deck of the cage and had given the signal to hoist. The supposition is that the unfortunate man was under the impression that he had loaded the car on the top deck of the cage and that the lower deck was now in place waiting for another car. This he pushed to the shaft and with it went to his death, falling a distance of 450 feet. When found, he was in an awful mutilated condition, his head practically torn off and almost every bone in his body broke. Wednesday, an inquest was held. From the testimony obtained, it was clearly proved that the death was purely accidental. So let's be reminded that falling down a shaft means the victim would impact all those timber sets and then be spinning and bouncing off the timbers all the way down the shaft. Can you imagine a more horrific death? June 6, 1914, Silver King Coalition Mine Shaft, Patrick Lane. A fatal accident occurred at the Silver King Coalition about 2 o'clock Tuesday morning. Patrick Lane, a miner who had been in the employ of the company for only 3 weeks, was tending station on the 900 level, and in some unaccountable manner, ran a mine car into the shaft, he going down with it to his death. No one saw the accident, and nothing was known of it until signals failed to attract the attention of the station tender. An investigation was started, and the first sign of the unfortunate man was his boots, which were found near the 1,000 level. The body was found in the sump on the 1,300 level, badly bruised and mangled. So this section is going to describe accidents where the victim fell off a moving cage in the shaft. In this photograph, note the double-deck cages have no sides or doors, and there are 6 miners on each deck. All of them will be exposed to potential contact with the shaft timbers rushing by only inches away as the cages travel down the shaft. See how crowded the men are in the cages. The typical size of these decks in the early days was between 13 and 15 square feet, about the size of your kitchen table. August 2nd, 1890, Ontario No. 3 shaft, William Warren. As is usual, after eating their midnight lunch, the miners boarded one of the cages to go down in the shaft and renew their work. Warren was one of these, and his position in descending the shaft happened to be on the outside row of the lower deck of the cage. The cage had descended but a few feet when the man standing next to Warren observed that he apparently was fainting, but the man, having only one hand free, was unable to keep Warren from falling against the side of the shaft, and in an instant, Warren was mashed by the downgoing cage. This happened about 100 feet down, and the cries of the men in the cage who knew that something terrible was occurring, being heard on top, caused the engineer to stop. But it was too late, and Warren's body fell into the pump shaft, or the service compartment, and then back into the middle compartment, and then down into the sump, in all a distance of 800 feet. As quickly as possible, his terribly mangled and lifeless body was taken to the surface. Here's an early photo of a mine shaft near Park City. The miners are crowded onto the cage, ready for their trip down the shaft. Again, note the lack of any protection for the miners on the four sides of the cage, with 6 miners on the top deck and 8 on the bottom. Keep your body and lunch pails tucked in, guys. Also note the simple railings around the shaft at the surface and how nonchalant the 2 guys are standing next to the shaft, leaning on the railings. Yes, different shifts. Yeah. October 10th, 1903. Silver King Consolidated Shaft, Michael Duffy. Michael Duffy, a man of about 48 years of age, and for 2 years a resident of Park City, was instantly killed in the Silver King Consolidated last Sunday morning by falling a distance of about 300 feet in the shaft. Some idea of the great force of his fall may be gained from the fact that the body crashed through a floor of 2-inch planking in the bottom of the shaft and landed in the sump. From the testimony of fellow workmen at the inquest, it was proved conclusively that the man's death was due to his own carelessness in attempting to ring the bell to stop the cage while the cage was in motion. Duffy reached with one hand for the bell cord on the side of the shaft to give the signal to stop, and was immediately told by his companions to desist, as it takes an experienced man to pull the cord while the cage is in motion. Duffy, however, instead of letting someone else do it, attempted to grasp it with both hands, lost his balance, and fell to his death. Compensation. Here's a photo of another mine shaft near Park City. Again, there's no protection for the miners as they travel in the shaft. Also note the simple railings around the shaft as meager protection against workers on the surface falling down. So this next group of articles describe the incidents where workers on the surface fell down the shafts. Here's the ground level of the old Daily West shaft near Park City. Simple wood safety bars enclose the top of the shaft. Look how casual the one guy is, leaning on the safety bar next to the open shaft compartment that is over 2,100 feet deep. For perspective, the highest observation deck of the Empire State Building is 1,224 feet high. December 14, 1895, Crescent Mine Incline Shaft, Marion Christian. The Crescent Mine Incline Shaft is 2,000 feet back in a tunnel. The other miners in the next shift were getting ready to enter the manway compartment of the Crescent Mine Incline Shaft when they heard a smothered exclamation and turned to see Christian's upraised hands as he fell into the manway feet first. Horrified, the men rushed to the mouth of the shaft and heard the dull thuds of the body as it was dashed back and forth in the small compartment and finally struck on the landing at the 200 station. Whether the doomed man's feet slipped, whether he lost a handhold, was taken with a fainting spell, or was impelled for some unknown force to jump into the open manway will always remain a mystery. The fearfully crushed and mangled remains were gathered up by his companions and brought down to town and turned over to the undertaker, Richardson. Here's a photograph of an incline shaft with the miner riding the cage with 2 mine cars. Can you imagine what would happen to someone falling, rolling, and bouncing down such a shaft? Here's a picture of a shaft station that we saw earlier with just a simple safety bar protecting the open hoisting compartment on the left. That would be no impediment to someone who intended to end his life in a shaft. May 30, 1924, Judge Mine Shaft, John Rosie. A rather unusual suicide occurred at the 1200 level of the Judge Mine Wednesday morning. John Rosie, a young Russian about 30 years old, who had been in the employ of the Park City Mining and Smelting Company since 1918, with other employees, walked into the 1200 level tunnel about 7:55 a.m. to take the cage for their various places of work in the mine. The cage was at the station, ready to hoist the men to different levels. With the rest of the men who had walked into the 1200 station was a brother of Rosie, the two being on the shift as partners. While waiting for the rest of the shift to arrive, John Rosie sat down on his lunch bucket for a minute or two, without a word, suddenly got up, walked around the cage to the other open compartment of the shaft, and grasping the safety bar with both hands, quickly leaped over it into the deep abyss, to the horror of his brother and the other men who witnessed this act, yet having not the slightest idea of the intention of the man who went to his death. The body fell 400 feet, and the investigation showed that for 300 feet, the body went straight down before striking the side of the shaft when the head was severed from the body. The head and the boots being found on the wall timbers between the 1500 and 1600 levels. The body was at the bottom of the 25-foot sump and was recovered with difficulty only after 3 hours of hard work. So, we've been talking largely about the dangerous conditions that occurred in the early mines, but I want to end my presentation on a more reassuring note. Electrification of the mining industry came to Park City in the 1880s and 1890s. By the early 1900s, most of the steam-powered hoisting equipment had been replaced with modern electric-powered systems. And these included automatic controls, making the hoisting process much safer than before, and practically eliminating overruns of the cages. This photo is of the Thames Mine hoist room in 1937. This is a modern hoist with easily controlled electric and hydraulic systems compared to the complicated mechanical systems of the prior steam-powered hoists. And this reduced the operator errors of the hoist engineer. To improve safety at the ground surface, shaft openings are now surrounded with secure walls and doors to prevent persons from falling or jumping down the shafts from the surface. Modern shaft stations are brightly lit, and the shafts are surrounded with solid walls and secure doors. Rock is typically no longer lifted in mine cars, but in automatic skips, so that the mine cages are well-lit compartments with walls, doors, and ceilings dedicated for the protection of miners being transported in the shafts. And here's a mine station, in an underground mine station in a shaft. You can just see how different it is. As a consequence of government regulations, increased automation, and more mining company awareness, fatality numbers for the mining industry in the U.S. that were over 1,000 per year before 1910 dropped to about 100 per year by the 1980s and to about 40 per year by 2023. To put this in perspective, the fatality count for the U.S. agricultural and forestry workers in 2023 was over 400. The fatality count for commercial truck drivers that same year was roughly 5,000. A significant reason for the dramatic drop in mining worker fatalities is the increase in mining efficiency. In the 1880s, a single miner could move about 1 ton of rock in a mine car. Nowadays, a single miner can move about 200 to 250 tons of rock with just a medium-sized haul truck in an open pit mine. Now I want to introduce a special guest and friend of mine, Dr. Tom Schwenk. He practiced medicine during the last years of mining in Park City and responded to the last shaft fatality near town at the Daly West shaft. Tom is also the author of Beyond the False Summit, which is a novel set in Park City in the 1890s. I think it's beautifully descriptive of the living and the work conditions in town back then, and I highly recommend it to you. And so Diane has brought some copies of the book for you tonight. So now I will read the last newspaper article for this evening as Tom comes on up here, and then I'll turn it over to Tom for his own comments on his practice serving Park City miners and his recollection of the Daly West shaft incident. And then after Tom's comments, I'll conclude the presentation and we can take questions. The last shaft fatality reported in Park City, March 20, 1980, Daly West shaft, R. Scott Russell. A 22-year-old Utah County man was killed Monday in an industrial accident at the Daly West mine south of Park City. R. Scott Russell of Wallsburg and another unnamed employee were riding the east cage of the two-compartment shaft when the accident occurred. According to Noranda, the two miners were riding from the 2100 level to the surface when Russell was pulled between the cage and the wall timbers of the shaft and fell to the bottom. The cage was apparently between 30 and 50 feet from the surface when the accident occurred. Investigators were unable to determine exactly why Russell was pulled from the cage, but some think a tool belt may have caught on the shaft wall. The space between the compartment side or the cage edge ranges between 4 and 10 inches in 5-foot intervals, which is the spacing between the sets, the timber sets, indicating that Russell was crushed to death before plunging to the bottom of the shaft. Lamar Gray, the only witness to the accident, confirmed earlier reports that the pair had failed to close the door to the cage in which they were riding before beginning their ascent. Gray's only statement was that he saw Russell stoop forward as if he wanted to look at his boots, and then he just disappeared. So now I ask Tom to come on up and give us a few comments.
Brian, thank you very much. Good to see all of you, some familiar faces. I'll make just a couple of comments. I did practice here from 1978 to 84, and I had the privilege of caring for several of the elderly miners who had worked the mines in the early 1900s and 19-teens. And I'll mention a story about that in just a moment. I did have the unfortunate duty to respond to this accident. I was called out of the office by the volunteer EMTs who'd been called to the mine and been told of the accident, and they then called me. I think it's pretty clear to everyone that there was not going to be any medical care rendered, that this was clearly going to be a fatality, but I think they wanted the emotional support and wanted an attending physician. came to the head frame. The EMTs had been there, had been down to the bottom, 2,100-foot level, and had come back up just as I arrived with a body bag. I will spare you some of the graphic details, although Brian did not. But I'll just say that the body bag was not in the shape of a body. And it was thought that something had caught. The tool belt was one possibility. Another thought was a spike or something on one of the timbers that caught his rubber coat that is very tightly fit, and cage kept going up, and he came out. The theory that he was crushed between the cage and the timber set is a good theory, but we won't know. I will say, to pick up on what Brian has said before, is that it takes about 14 seconds to fall 2,100 feet. He was clearly dead long before he hit the bottom, and the bouncing back and forth did cause the dismembering that Brian described in some of his Park Record articles. So it was a very traumatic event for all of us. I'm not sure who was providing emotional support to whom at that point, because it was just a terribly catastrophic and tragic event. I'll make one other comment about caring for miners. I did have the privilege of caring for some of the elderly retired miners, and one in particular stands out. Jack and Rose lived toward the top of Daly Avenue, and he had worked the mines again as a teenager and into the 20s and in the 19-teens. And he would tell me lots of stories. I would go up to see Jack and Rose on Saturday afternoon, make house calls, took our 3-year-old daughter with me. And I would attend to Jack and do some minor medical things while Rose was making cookies for our daughter in her wood-fired stove. This was in one of the little shacks that's right along the stream up Daly Avenue. One of those little shacks that's now listed for $3 million. But Jack would tell me stories about his experience, and the one that stood out to me that I'll tell that'll pick up on something important that Brian said is the issue of silicosis. So Jack was a smart guy, and he was working the mines in his teens and early 20s. And he noticed that miners in their late 20s and 30s, still a young age, even in the early 1900s, were dying of lung disease and what was called miner's con or consumption. And that was silicosis. Silicosis is characteristic of hard rock mining, and especially with pneumatic drills when you generate huge amounts of dust, as Brian talked about. If you look at silica crystals under the microscope, they're very sharp-edged, pointed little crystals, and you inhale those, and they basically cut into the lungs, which then causes scarring, and eventually the lungs become just so completely scarred that you basically suffocate. Silicosis was complicated by tuberculosis, which was rampant at the time as well, and so you might have both. And they were very different types of lung disease, and the combination of the two was horrendous. So Jack told me that he observed this in some of his friends and said that he went to the foreman one day and said that he wanted to come up to the surface and work. He said, there's something going on down there, and it's killing people. There were no regulations about this and no controls on any of this. There was a lot of work to try to get water irrigated drills to try to dampen the dust, and that didn't happen for quite some time. The foreman said, well, Jack, you can come up, but you'll take a pay cut. So if you work the mines, you make $3.50 a day. That's $3.50. If you work on the surface, you take a $1 cut. You make $2.50 a day. Jack said, that's fine. I'll live. And he did. And he was in his 80s when I was taking care of him. So he was a smart guy. And a lot of guys were not smart or didn't have the opportunity or couldn't afford to not work the mines. Silicosis, interestingly, just as an aside, is making a re-entrance in the coal mines in the east because they're starting to mine coal in hard rock areas. And so what used to be black lung disease with coal dust is now silicosis with silica crystals. So with that, I took too much time. Sorry. I congratulate Brian on a very authoritative and expert presentation, fabulous research, and it's just a pleasure to be part of the program. Brian, thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. So as you might guess, I'm a member of the Friends of Ski Mountain Mining History, and it's a committee of the Park City Museum, and our mission is to save the historical mining structures still standing around Park City. Because the mining history of Park City is an important legacy worth preserving. And so if you're interested to lend a hand and support our mission, please let me know tonight, or you can visit the museum's website at the address shown on this slide. And with that, we'll wrap this presentation up, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. The question is, was there insurance for the widows of the victims of these accidents? And that answer's a little complicated. There were sort of mutual support societies, a number of them that the miners belonged to and their families back in those days. And one of the reasons for joining those societies was because they would band together their dues and would basically self-insure the members of those organizations. And so, yes, there was sort of a life insurance situation there. Where there was a realization that the mining company itself was potentially responsible, even though they may have been determined to not be responsible legally, the mining companies would provide funds to the survivors of some of these families. And if you come back on December 3rd, we'll talk about the big explosion at the Daly West mine. And at that time, the Daly West Mining Company was very generous in providing funds to the widows and the families of the victims of that accident. So good question, thank you. Yeah. The skier subway was built in the 1960s, and it did operate through a mine tunnel, the Spiral Mine Tunnel, and it took skiers about 2.5 miles back into the mountain in the tunnel, where they could then connect and have a short walk to the bottom of the Thames shaft, the 1700 level of the Thames shaft, and then ride that cage up to the surface. And I've always wondered, imagine the lift line at the 1700 level in a wet mine, waiting for your chance to get maybe 5 or 6 people on that little cage to be lifted 1,700 feet up to the surface so you could start your skiing. So that's a different situation than what we were talking about, but it was partially operated with the Thames shaft and with the Thames cage. Yes, behind you. That developed over time, Ron, and you know that we have the photograph of that one cage that did have sides and doors on it, and those did come about over time. But in the early days, in the 1880s and 1890s, the cages, those photographs that I was showing you of the guys just jammed onto those little cages with no sides on them, that's what they were like back then. Way in the back. My report does address that a little bit. The difficulty with really doing statistical work on this is that I relied a lot on the park record, and the park record's only been around since 1880. And so mining was occurring here, a lot of mining was occurring here before 1880. And so there must have been multiple accidents that occurred back then that just aren't recorded. And so my conclusion was it's not worth spending much time doing statistics on the available data when you know there's earlier data that you just don't have. Yes. The question is, what happens when the hoist cable breaks on a cage? There are a couple articles in the record about just exactly that. And remember the photograph that I showed you looking down the shaft, and there were those wooden runners that were attached on either side of the compartment. The cages that slid up and down on those wooden guides had spring-loaded cams that would close automatically against those wood guides for that very reason. So if the cage became disconnected from the hoist rope, it would start to fall, but you wouldn't have any pull on the springs that are keeping those grips open. And so they failed safe. And so if the cage started to fall, those grips would tightly close onto the guides. And they sometimes worked. Any other questions? Yes.
In one of your earlier slides, you were showing the hoist control and how my question is, how did the operator know what level the cage was on by the indicator that the
Yes. The question is, how did the operator know where the cage was by looking at those indicators? And in the early days, they had those drums. And the actual indicator or the arrow would move up and down the length of that. And so those were labeled. And so the shaft engineer, the hoist operator, could see where the cage was by where it was on that tall cylinder. Now, the more modern hoist that we have a photograph of, that has been replaced with a dial, and the arrow moves around the dial, and the operator would make marks on the outside periphery of that dial. So when the arrow approached that, the operator would know, okay, the cage is at the right spot. Yes, sir. Yeah, good question. I attribute a lot of that to lawyers. And the mining companies, in fact, right today, if you wanted to go visit a mining company, a reasonable sized mining company, and just go and see what they're doing, you couldn't get past the front gate unless you showed that you had an MSHA certified miner permit. And that's a 24-hour training course. And then you would have to take the mine-specific safety briefing, usually at the guardhouse, as you go into the mine area, which talks about the mine policies and what the risks are at that specific mine. So there's a tremendous focus nowadays on making sure that anybody that's in the mine limits has been thoroughly trained on the risks and the safety. and the mitigative measures that the mine has adopted for all those safety hazards. The reason why that's happened is, in my understanding, these miners unionized towards the beginning of the 20th century. There were mine unions that actually came about, and those unions pressed the mining companies for not only wages and working hours, but also for safety. In the 1970s and 1980s, the federal government started coming out with mine safety regulations, and those applied to all the different types of mining in the country. So it was a combination, I think, of government regulation stepping up and pressure from the miners' unions and lawyers who really made the mining companies step up to pay way more attention to the safety of their staff. It's even gotten to the point where on one of the mines I visited, my whole career I was doing mining work. One of the mines I visited, they recognized that the most dangerous thing that their employees, their miners, experienced every day they went to work was the commute from town to the mine. Statistically, that was the biggest risk that all their employees had. And so the mining company decided to mitigate that risk by contracting with a commercial bus company. And these miners now would drive to the parking lot in town, park their cars, and they were required to take the bus out to the mine to eliminate that personal commute that they were doing in their pickup trucks. So there's been a huge transformation in the awareness of safety by the mining companies. Thanks for that question.
There was a famous phrase attributed to a mine owner in the 1880s, 1890s, when there were no regulations and it was completely the responsibility of the miners as to their safety, as you can tell from Brian's excellent description. There had been a cave-in because it was thought that the mine had not been timbered properly and the sets were too far apart. There had been a cave-in that had killed a miner, and the mine owner was said to have said that miners are cheaper than lumber. And that was the attitude of the time, and I'm sure you've heard that.
Well, back in the 1870s, 1880s, the average annual pay rate for most adult men in the country was about $200 to $300 a year. Most of them worked on the farm. Some of them worked in retail in their local community, and very few of them worked in mining, railroad, and so on. Like Tom was saying, it was almost an unlimited number of guys who were very willing to take any kind of job they could, get off the farm, and make some decent money. I mean, a miner who had almost no experience moving to Park City could make $400 to $500 a year, which was big bucks back in the 1880s. And so there was no lack of guys waiting to get work here. Anything else? Excellent. Thanks very much.